everybody. Welcome back to Victory Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Mike K. Young, and I have a special guest with me today, Brother Michael Lopez, and honored that he would come on here today. And something we were just talking about before the podcast is it got to a place where people were with me before doing podcasting and interviews and talking, but I love the podcast feel of talking and having the conversation back and forth, and just getting different perspectives, getting different stories, different views on different things. And the reason I wanted to have Brother Mike on here today is to talk about education, to talk about how we can learn and different things. Well, honestly, like I want it to flow, so it could be, there ain't no telling what we could talk about. But just having a conversation on how we can improve spiritually, how we can learn how to apply more things and learn more things, biblically speaking as well. And I know one of the things, I thought of a statement earlier before we came up here that someone said recently. They said, all men are my teachers. And so they're either teaching me what not to do or teaching me what to do. And that's what we want to kind of talk about today is learning and just learning to apply things, because we all are learning something and we all have a source of where we're gaining knowledge and experience different things, but the source is definitely very important. And so I'm honored to have him on here today. And so what I would like to start with here today is just maybe your testimony, how you came to Christ, and then just kind of what led to where you are now. I'd just love to hear that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate that. So I came to know Christ when I was 12 years old. I grew up in a solid Christian home, and so I grew up hearing the gospel, and my parents were first generation Christians, and so they were definitely, they came out of the Catholic tradition, and so growing up in South Texas, it's like 90% Catholic, I think. And so my mom was led to the Lord first, and then she had a burden for my dad, and eventually my dad, who was into alcohol, and my parents were on the verge of divorce, but Jesus saved him. Amen. And then at the end of the day, Jesus saved their marriage. And so and then I came along later in life, and I'm the youngest of four. And so I grew up hearing the gospel, but I didn't make it personal until I was 12. Got baptized when I was 13. And I knew that the Lord was calling me into the ministry, but I didn't know what that meant or what that looked like. And to be honest, I kind of ran from that. Unfortunately was a typical teenager, but the Lord grabbed a hold of my heart when I was going into my senior year of high school. And so surrendered to what he wanted, and at the time I just thought it was going to be an evangelist. And so my goal was just, very, very selfish, and I knew evangelists went out and spoke a lot, and I thought, well, that's what I want to do. And so that's what I majored in college, and then but the Lord works in very unique ways and prepares you and has you meet people along the way and has you hold certain positions to prepare you for whatever he wants, as long as we are open to that. And so right now I'm a U.S. Army chaplain, and so I would have never in a million years, if I was 10 years old and given a book that was blank, and if someone said, write your life script, I would have never put that in there. I didn't know that would be even a thing. And so I always wanted to join the military. When I was in high school, that's when 9/11 happened. My grandfather fought in World War II, and my dad was a Marine, and so no one else was carrying on the military torch. But again, the Lord called me into the ministry, and I never saw ministry and military go hand in hand. And so I just did what naturally came next. Opportunities arose, went to college, and then during my college years, the Lord allowed me to speak a lot and to hold different Bible studies and outreaches there on our college campus, and was a student leader, got involved in various things. And he put me into very uncomfortable positions to grow me and stretch me. And then after college, my wife and I got married, and we traveled for the college for 2 years, and that it was like full-time job. So we were on the road every day for 2 years, staying in hotels, and we were speaking at about 2 or 3 Christian schools a day. And then we would send in our recordings of our speaking to headquarters, and they would judge us harshly on our speaking. And I felt very offended that I had like these professional speech people judging me as a preacher. Like, who are they to judge me, a preacher, a man of God? And so I was very, of course, ignorant. And but the Lord used that to grow me and stretch me in ways that I wouldn't have known that I needed. And it was very painful. It was like the Lord chipping away pride at me along the way. And then after that, became a dorm manager, very random, for one semester of a men's dorm there at the college. So my wife and I lived at the bottom floor, and there were 800 guys in our dorm, and so we oversaw that. We felt like their parents, and so that also brought along unique challenges, and the Lord was growing us again. And then one day I got a random call from the senior pastor at the church there where I went to school, and they said, "Hey, we need a church administrator. Can I interview you?" And I said, "Sure." So interviewed me, got that job, and so I was working on my Master of Divinity while I was doing that. And so I was a church administrator, and it's a large church, large staff, and was given very unique roles and opportunities. Again, Lord chipping away at my pride. Speaking a lot and holding meetings with people I should have never been in front of. And I was young, but again, the Lord was growing me and stretching me and preparing me. That's not what I signed up for when I went to school. And then I felt like the Lord was moving us on, and I didn't know, where or why or how, but the Lord did, and ended up becoming a Christian school administrator in North Carolina. I had really no educational background, honestly. And so when I went to that church, I was just honest and said, I don't have an educational background. My Master of Divinity had maybe one education course. That was it. And so I'm not really qualified. They said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of that. We'll help you get the degrees you need." And I said, "Okay." So my wife and I went by faith, and great church, awesome church. And it was a struggling school. And so I was given the task to help revive it, if you will. And so through the degrees and through the experience and school of hard knocks, again, the Lord using what was in the past to prepare me for that moment that I never would have realized. Looking back, I was putting the pieces together, and I thought, wow, that's why I went through this back then, or that's why I had this experience, and it wasn't even over yet. So after I did that, I got my educational degrees, and then the Lord again put on our heart this compelling sense of we're not where we're supposed to be anymore. Well, what was next? And so through a series of events and through the Lord working, we ended up joining the Army chaplaincy. And so again, I'm in a very unique position now. Looking back, the Lord has worked in various steps to prepare me for where I'm at now. And so that's the short version of how I got saved all the way up to present life. And so
that's awesome, man. And thank you for your service, by the way. I appreciate that. So would you say, through the different experiences that you had, God, which a lot of people don't think about it like that. A lot of people don't think maybe I'm in this season, or maybe I'm going through this because God is preparing me for something bigger. We normally just think, let me just get through this. What's next? And we're trying to move along all the time. Would you say that God uses opportunity and then placing a desire in your heart to, as you're going through things, to try to mold you? Because, you said you were doing public speaking, and then God put you in a position where you're now helping people. You were like a parent to 800 people. And then now God has put you in the opportunity where you're doing both, in a way. So would you say that God, throughout everybody's life, is just using events and putting you in a place to say, I've got you down the road doing something, but you need to be focused on learning where you are right now and trying to make the most out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we're very linear in our thinking. So we think as far as we can see. And so because of that, we make very, very bad decisions, sometimes on impulse, because we get cocky and we say, well, I can't see how the Lord would do XYZ because of my current situation. Whereas the Lord sees the end from the beginning. And so he's creating this plan for you, and but we can't see while we're in it, exactly what's happening.
Yes,
and yes, he is preparing us for future things, but in that moment, it's not wasted time, right? So we are in that moment because that's where we're supposed to be then.
Yeah.
And so if we live within the will and peace of God, doing what we're supposed to be doing in that moment, then the next steps will just kind of naturally come. And so I've kind of come to grips with the reality, like the Lord's in control of my life, and I'm going to do my best right now. And
awesome.
I have no intention of leaving the Army.
Yeah.
But if he does, I'm just going to go with it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I have no doubt whatever's next, he was preparing me right now.
Right.
He is preparing me right now. And there are things I'm going through. I'm being stretched right now with things that I'm not comfortable with. But I'm not old by any means, but I have enough life experience that has taught me that just because it hurts or I'm uncomfortable, it doesn't mean I'm in the wrong place.
Right.
So, yeah.
I like that. And then those are the times where you grow the most, because when you're in your comfort zone, I mean, you're just going through the motions. But when you're being stretched, like you were saying, I love that phrase. But as you're being stretched, you're like, man, you're growing more and more for the next task. And not only for the next task, but also for people who go through the same thing, where you're like, man, I went through that as well, but use this as a learning period. This is God growing you for the future and using you. And I'm very interested in the topic, what we were talking about before, is as far as education. So if God was growing you, bringing you through different things, what made you interested or passionate in the subject of education? Because a lot of this, the growing and going through things, is a way of learning as well. But how did God place you in that? Or how did you develop a heart for education and wanting to teach people and wanting to help people in that specific field, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, it's one of those things where you say, oh, the Lord would never do or put me in, I'm never called to.
Yeah.
Growing up, I was a horrible student, just to be frank. And my wife is the opposite. Like, she grew up and she's still a genius. I am not. I am where I am today because I know how to work hard, but I'm not smart, like, at all. I just read a lot, and I can outwork, the next guy. And so it takes me 3 times as long as her to learn something, just because I'm just not naturally gifted in that way. And so I was a teacher's worst nightmare for academically and then behaviorally. Like, I was not the best behaved student growing up. And so to think that I would eventually run a school, like, I would have laughed. I would have laughed if God had told me when I was 16 years old, someday you're going to be running a classroom. No way. So, but yeah, so I was put into the position of education because that's what the Lord called me to in that moment. So it's one of those things where you try your best in that moment to be excellent. And so I would have never wished education upon me, but since it was upon me, I thought, well, I'm going to give it the best I've got. And so, I was going through the formal education process through these degrees of learning education, but I was also in the midst of it. And so I went beyond the classroom of being instructed to taking it and saying, well, how can I be better personally? So I was reading books outside of the classroom, and I was going to seminars and just trying to be the best school administrator that I could be. And then I also taught while I was a school administrator. And so, and then as a school administrator, you observe teachers all the time. And so I learned very quickly what was good and what was bad teaching. And so, but then how do you coach good teachers to be better? And how do you coach incredible teachers to go to that what's called 0.1%, where few get to? So even better than that. And so it meant that I was going to have to coach myself and cultivate myself. And so that's what I did. I read a lot, and I was not afraid of failure because I was in an environment where the pastor allowed me to fail because he understood that was necessary in order to succeed. And so if you're afraid of failure, like, you don't really grow from always winning, So, but when you lose a few battles, you can look back and you can do an assessment and say, what did I do wrong? I look back my first year running that school to my last year, and, I'm embarrassed about some of the things I said or did within that first year. But I'll never do that again, right? Or I'll never approach that situation the same, just various things where the Lord just kind of teaches you, like, this is the right way through experience, but then also through classroom. So education became, because I was in that moment, and I just wanted excellence, because God is a God of excellence, and we're created in His image to bear His image, and He is excellent. And so I said, I'm going to be all things excellent in this world that I'm called to right now. And so I learned all I could about education while I was in it, and it did. It led me. It opened up opportunities and doors that I would have never dreamed of. Our school wasn't accredited when I got there. And so I had to figure it out, like, what is accreditation? I mean, what does that even look like? And it was embarrassing how I found out we weren't accredited. But then my pastor was like, oh, yeah, by the way, that's one of your tasks. You need to get the school accredited. And I said, oh, surprise. Yay. Yeah. Super. So anyways, you just kind of learn by, putting your hands to the plow and asking people that are good in that subject matter, whatever it is. And I sat at lunches, coffees with people who were great, and I picked their brains, and I grew from there. And then the Lord allowed me to be, so we got accredited, and then we got reaccredited, but then the Lord allowed me to be on accreditation teams. Like, again, I'm now the one going to schools evaluating if they should be accredited or not. To me, that doesn't even make sense, because I was a horrible student. Again, like, only the Lord could write that story. And he honors those who honor him in their calling. And so I was not comfortable oftentimes as a school administrator. There were a ton of uncomfortable moments, probably more uncomfortable than comfortable. But it's what I knew the Lord called us to. And so we stuck to it, and the Lord honored and blessed, and our school grew, our staff grew, and we were able to do things that we would never imagine. But
that's awesome. So, we hear all the time about God's forgiveness and God's long suffering, and we would say, without hesitation, God's forgiven me and He's forgotten it. And we see that long suffering, but I think the problem that we have is we're not long suffering with ourselves. And how would you say that you got to that place where you learned to give grace to yourself? Because everybody thinks that if I make a mistake, that I'm not made out for learning this or growing in this area, when in reality, the majority of it is mistakes as you're growing. And so how would you say that you developed or are developing, having grace and being long-suffering with yourself as you're learning? Because it applies to every part of learning and education. It's if I'm trying to be more like Christ, I'm making mistakes. And so it's being long-suffering with myself to say, I'm going to grow in grace. I'm going to improve in this area. It's really in every area of life. So how would you say that you developed grace and long-suffering with yourself, knowing that God gave it to you, but learning that we also have to give it to ourselves as we're growing in these different areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a loaded question. So theologically, I had to come to the point personally where, because I did a lot of bad stuff when I was a teenager. And so it's like, how do you forgive yourself for that? And so I had to come to the realization that whether my feelings are okay with forgiveness or not, because sometimes we feel like, oh, I have to do penance. Like, yeah, I understand theologically and mentally that God has forgiven me and it's done. But because we're humans, and the way we think is, well, still I have to work off something, surely. And so I had to get to the place where I just came to just an understanding that whether or not I feel forgiven, I am. So that is the reality. I have to live in that reality. I cannot make up my own reality. I can't beat myself up because God's not beating me up. And so when we do otherwise, then we declare ourselves a better judger of sins than God. That's like ridiculous, right? And so, but if I live in God's reality, then I can live in this like perpetual state of forgiveness, knowing that God has forgiven me. And really, when that clicks for you, and we're all at different places, and I'm not sure where you are today, but when that clicks for you, truly, there's this peace that passes all understanding. It doesn't even make sense. And yes, the devil's going to try to fight you, and your flesh fails you, and you may try to beat yourself up, over again, but that's where walking in the Spirit comes in, and you just again remind yourself, no, I'm living in this reality, not my reality. There's only one reality, and reality is what corresponds with truth, and the truth is found within God's word. So there's that theologically. But then practically, like every day, I think I've failed so much, to be honest, that I'm now not embarrassed about it.
Hmm.
Like I've come to a place where it's comfortable. I'm comfortable with it. And then I also understand the science behind
Yeah.
learning. And so learning, in order to properly learn, you have to fail.
Hmm.
Like there is no such thing as true learning without failure scientifically.
Hmm.
So we cannot argue that from a science perspective. And so, yeah, we like judge other people like, oh, he messed up. He should have done better. But honestly, we should coach people through failure. So like right now, I'm working on a project for the Army that I would have never in a million years thought of I'd be working on.
Yeah.
And I was very honest with the people who asked me to work on it for them. I said, it's going to take failure, just so you know,
Yeah.
in order for me to get where you want me to be. And they said, that's fair. That's good. That's fine. And so while I'm working on it, I'm understanding that I'm failing, but I'm not judging myself harshly for it.
Yeah.
I'm learning from it. I'm asking for feedback. I'm constantly asking for constructive criticism, because if I don't get that, then how can I make it better?
Yeah.
I'm not offended by it because they're not attacking me, the person, Mike Lopez. It's just the product that we're trying to make better.
Yeah.
And so, but in order to get there, you have to fail. And so think of a student who is trying to master, a set of memory verses maybe,
Yeah.
or a poem for a class, or lines for a play.
Yeah.
And so whenever true learning or memorization comes, there has to be forgetting that actually takes place. So if you never forget, it's never going to go in your long-term memory. So that's why they say with like memory cards, interleave your studying. So in other words, study that for 20 minutes, put it away, move on to another subject for 20 minutes, move on to another subject. And guess what? By the time you get back to this first subject, you've forgotten it, and that's okay. Like that's fine.
crazy.
That's
Yeah.
actually a part of learning.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of boring studies that, you can go out and read yourself of, of people who have done better. You can give a task to somebody and they can study that subject for 3 hours.
Yeah.
That's all they study is 3 hours. Take someone who interleaves their study,
Yeah.
which means forgetting, and they actually outperform the person who just spent all 3 hours on that study. So you lock it in your long-term memory. If you enter your short-term memory, it's like writing in the sand. Like, it might be there, but it might not.
Yeah.
And so that's why, as a school administrator and teacher, I heard 1,000 times.
Yeah.
I stayed up all night.
Yeah.
I studied. Okay, well that means nothing, because your brain actually doesn't work that way. Like you didn't give yourself time to forget.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't give ourselves time to fail. And that's a part of why we're not better at XYZ.
Yeah, that's crazy. I was actually reading the book that you suggested to me, Making It Stick, which is a phenomenal book, by the way, so far. I'm like halfway
Highly
through
recommend. Do you remember who wrote that? Do you remember the author? I don't.
it.
Anyways,
have
make
it.
it stick. Make it stick.
I have it on my
Go look it
phone. I could probably find it, but it's a fantastic book, and I'm about halfway through it. I was listening to it even more today. I'm like in preparation, because we're gonna get together. But if I heard him right, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, when you're learning information, one of the things that you need to go through is a testing period after learning information, like so quizzes and different things like that. And it's definitely, he even mentioned too, along with what you were saying about flashcards and mixing it up. You don't just go in the one order of learning something, you mix things up. So like you said, forgetting. But he had also said, when you're going through that and you need to be tested after learning something to, I guess, properly get and retain the information. And what they were talking about was retrieval, as far as learning to remember when you're being tested, what you need to remember when you're going through that. So retrieval is something that really helps you learn. And I guess I thought of that spiritually, as far as when we learn information, when we learn the Word of God, we need to be tested on that to properly allow it to become in our life. But then learning to retrieve what we need to retrieve, like the Word of God, these different things to help us through these different problems. I don't know if you had any other thoughts as far as that goes, as far as like not only being tested, but maybe learning that retrieval aspect, I guess. If you remember what I'm talking about. I just now heard that recently, but
Yeah, no, that's good. So yeah, I mean, there has to be, so how do you validate true learning? By assessment.
Hmm.
So if you can't regurgitate somehow, some way that you know the material, then how do you know if you actually learned it? So
Hmm.
everyday life, this translates in a way where we actually practice it.
Yeah.
So, for example, did you grow up in church?
I did grow
You
up in
did. Okay.
church, yes.
So I grew up in church too.
Okay.
And so, you can memorize your 10 Commandments, you can memorize your verses for Awana or Master Club or, whatever you grew up with. King's Kids is, another one that's out there. And so, you can memorize your verses for these things, but it doesn't mean you're living those verses. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So we can have the knowledge, without being wise. And so the Bible actually talks about that. So, there's the bottom level of understanding. Those are facts. Those are learning.
Yeah.
Those are needed
Yeah.
and essential, because when you're tested, then that's when things that base knowledge needs to be there in order
Right.
for you to live out properly. And so, then life circumstances happen, and then when life circumstances happen, how we react is actually the assessment, for if true learning took place. You've probably heard it said before that, hey, if you don't pass this test, the Lord's going to give it to you again. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know in school that's true. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't pass this test, the teacher's going to make you take
Yeah.
it again, right? But it makes sense, because God wants us to learn certain lessons, because he never wants us to stay where we are. He always tries to grow us. So we're trying to pass to the next grade, if you will.
Yeah.
How many grades are there spiritually? I don't know, an infinite amount,
Yeah.
right? So it's not like we can quantify it, but what we can do is if we do face that again, so we're being tested again. Well, Lord, you've already tested me in this subject. Why are you testing me again? Okay, well then use the knowledge and now experience
Yeah.
to prove to me again that you understand the information for the test. And so, this can happen with the loss of a loved one. This could happen when unexpected events come that you weren't expecting. In a controlled environment like a classroom, we can guess essay, true or false, right? Multiple choice. We can even ask the teacher
Yeah.
what's going to be on the test, and they can guide us.
Yeah.
But in life, man, you don't know what's going to come
Yeah,
up.
that's true.
You can't expect it. We don't know what's going to happen 2 hours from now. And so, but everything we're doing now spiritually is preparing us for these moments.
Yeah.
And so, in essence, when we go through that, the Lord's saying, can you retrieve the information that I have given you, that you've learned?
Yeah.
And it could be something we read from God's word that morning. We're being tested about it that afternoon. And do you really understand it? We're about to find out.
That happens
right?
too
And
often.
So that's really how it translates from theory
Yeah.
to the classroom, but then to everyday life. Like this is everybody. No one's exempt from being tested by life. And so how we handle it truly expresses what we know.
That happens too often, man. Like I'll share a truth to somebody, or I'll preach a truth, and God's like, all right, let's see what happens here. And then you have to go through that very thing, and then you're thinking about, I just preached this, and then now you're having to actually live this out. And as you were saying that, I thought about the disciples, and Jesus would bring them. He would tell them a truth. He would show them something miraculous, but then they would go through a storm, and then in the middle of the storm, like, carest thou not that we perish? Where are we going to find bread? And then Jesus literally says, do you not remember? Like, do you not? It's like that retrieval thing. Do you not remember what I just did? I just proved to you that I was God. I just proved to you that I could be there for you. But then having to go through the storms over and over and over again for that to finally lock in their brain, it's like, man, he's there for us. He's going to be there for us.
Yeah.
And
in the Army, we call it reps and sets. So
Yeah.
like the more reps and sets you get of something, a certain exercise or maneuvering through land,
Right.
or whatever it is, then it becomes automatic. It becomes a part of you. So in life, we need a lot of reps
Yeah.
and sets, in order to become more like Christ.
Yeah.
So,
I love that. Well, I guess one of the last questions, and this has been so helpful, even with me with opening some things up, but one of the questions I would have for you, because being in ministry, and I know you experience this as well in education, but also being a chaplain, where people need to learn things. People need to grasp things and apply it to their life. But there's so many people that say, man, I know that, I need that. But then they go the complete opposite way. They never apply it, and you keep watching them make the same mistakes over and over again, but they never actually learn. What would you say are hindrances to learning and to growing that people need to realize, okay, is this something that I actually have in my life that I need to get out so that I can actually learn what's beneficial for my life and how to apply that, if that makes sense? Because we deal with that constantly. Even with here, we share with God's word for their life, and you even share it with, even with jobs or anything. This is what you need to do, but then people go do the opposite. And there's hindrances that maybe in their head or whatever that keep them from learning. What would you say is some hindrances?
Yeah. So first, we as leaders, or if you're someone, if you're a parent and you're trying to help kids, or a teacher trying to help students, or discipler trying to disciple somebody, we need to understand that we need to give ourselves the same grace that we desire. So, it's easy for us who have already passed the test. And I remember experiencing this as a teacher, being like, why don't you know this information? Like, this isn't the first time that you've been tested on this material. Like, this is the fourth or fifth and you still don't know it. But I'm coming from a place of somebody who's mastered it, because I've taught it. I've had a lot of reps and sets. So for me, it's like, come on, you dummy, get it together. And so I feel like the more you've mastered something, the less patience you have with those who have not. But when I was in that student shoes, first learning that same subject before I became the teacher of it, I was probably pretty bad too. Now I can't remember that far, but I probably desired grace in those moments. And so, first of all, I think it's important just to deal with people as people. So never forget the human, part of it. Give people grace. Because God gives us grace.
Of course.
And so, the second is just understanding, the concept of free will, which I think we understand. So everyone has a choice, and we can't make them. We can't make people spiritual as badly as we want to. And so I've had students who were straight A students, valedictorian, salutatorians type students, who were honestly far from the Lord, but their grades said otherwise. Their habits of studying said otherwise. By all accounts, this person's good. This person's good for life. And so oftentimes we can put all of the assessment on the outside and not necessarily on the inside. So people have a free will. Just because they look spiritual doesn't always mean they are, or just because they don't look spiritual doesn't mean that they're not. And so, so that's another thing. And then the third thing is just ensuring that that we allow people to make mistakes. And sometimes, like, people just do it to themselves. But like part of, and you're probably reading, the book, part of learning is making mistakes, but it's struggling. And sometimes, we do this a lot in parenting. Like, we don't allow our kids to struggle because it pains us to see them struggle, or we don't have the patience to see them struggle. So we just feed them ourselves, or we just, we go ahead and carry them instead of making them do X, Y, Z, or you know what, I'll just do this because it makes my life easier. So we don't let them struggle, but learning comes through struggle. And as painful as it is to experience, and sometimes people need to experience struggle in order to come back around. And so that struggling doesn't have to be, it's sad, right? Because we on the other side say, you don't have to go through that. But that's what they're choosing for themselves. We've done our part. And so we need to release ourselves from the guilt of feeling like we have to control people. Because can you imagine being God? Like, even with us, like, who consider ourselves counselors or whatever, like, we still do dumb stuff. And so, the Lord must be out there thinking, why can't you get this right? And so a part of that is the struggle. A part of our journey is the struggle. Now, we shouldn't invite it. We shouldn't do it on purpose, nothing like that. But that's going to be a part of some people's struggle or life story. So when they go back and hopefully come back around in time
Yeah.
and come to get things right with the Lord, then that's now part of their life story.
Hmm.
But then they can help others walk
Yeah.
through that same thing. They'll be able to save some and not others.
Yeah.
But the ones they have saved, they wouldn't have. Maybe not saved in salvation, but spared from by giving advice.
Hmm.
And so they would not have otherwise been able to if they didn't themselves
Yeah.
go through that. And so it's this weird like circular cycle, and I feel like sometimes we want control, and we just don't have it.
Yeah.
And so we need to release ourselves from that thought. And I think that'll so in counseling they have what's called like attachment theories.
Yeah.
And sometimes counselors become so attached to the counselee or whoever it is that they're counseling that their problem becomes the counselor's problem. And it's actually really dangerous. Now, if that's your attachment style, so you're so empathetic, which it's key to be empathetic, but you're so empathetic that their problem now becomes yours. You live with that. You take that home, like it's not a bad thing, but it's good to be self-aware that that's your attachment style, and you have to work on that. And then some people some people don't have an attachment. Like, you can dump all your problems and I'm going to be empathetic, but when I go home, like,
it's gone.
It doesn't affect me, right? And so sometimes we wish, man, I wish that were me because, I'm too busy carrying your burden. And as pastors, part of being a pastor is being a shepherd, and part of being a shepherd is God gives you a very unique heart for people. And so we put on ourselves things that we should not. And I think we need to put more on the Lord than we do on ourselves, because he's ultimately the good shepherd. And so we're really just his under shepherd, doing his tasking. But ultimately, like, he desires for us to lay all of our burdens on him, including the burdens of those who put their burdens on us. And so that would kind of be my answer to that.
That is a fantastic answer. And that was so helpful. And I think the part that stuck out to me is doing our part. And that's all you can do, and leaving the results up to God. Because I know there's probably parents watching, there's probably spouses watching, pastors, different people that you seek to invest in people's lives, invest in your kids' life, and to see them maybe go their own way. And it's so discouraging at times in your own head. But then going, even as a preacher teaching in Sunday school or whatever, you're only responsible for what you do. You're not responsible for them. And at the end of the day, they make their decision. I think that's the thing that I deal with is I overthink through things, and I'm like, man, this so-and-so's they're making a bad decision, and they shouldn't be doing that. And I'm thinking through all these things, but allowing it to get into my head that as long as you do what God wants you to do, you do your part. You're not responsible for them, and they just leave the results up to God. Even with the witnessing, I plant the seed, watered, but God gave the increase. We can only control the witnessing, we can only control the investing, but we have to leave the result up to God, which is so hard to do because we're a result-based, I guess, thinkers. And so that's definitely something that I needed to hear that was so helpful. And I know we got to wrap up here soon because I know you've got to leave, but are there any final thoughts that you would want to add with maybe something we didn't cover, or any tips that you want to share just before we end the podcast today?
Maybe just end with a story, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
In the world of education, you deal with students, and so translate that in your own mind to your world, and I think you can easily make those connections. But there were so many students in my early administrative years that I wrote off, and I said, you're going to amount to nothing. And I know every educator has these stories, but it's just sad that we have to have those because of our mindset in our early years. Is so like, well, if you don't meet my standard or my school standard, you're done, you're useless. I've been proven wrong so many times because I'm not God. And my mind is so limited to understanding, and the Lord has a very specific will for every single individual. and it includes you or it doesn't include you. And
Hmm.
there were moments where I thought I was bigger than I was
Yeah.
in that person's life, and I tried to stop them, or I tried to control them, or I tried to help them, and that person didn't want it.
Yeah.
And so I wrote them off, said, "You're done." Either, kicking out students, or I mean, sometimes you have to in a private school, but or that student never talked to me again. But then they ended up, like today, being a great success story,
Mm.
not in the world's eyes, but for the Lord.
Yeah.
And so, like, they're right with the Lord. They have a family now, and
That's
the Lord is really using them. And it wasn't because of me.
Yeah.
I wrote them off as useless. And so,
Wow.
be careful who we write off, or think that we know what God has intended for that individual based upon where they're at now. So that would be my only caution, is just with
Yeah.
that brief story.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I know even as you're preaching, you're around people and their faces, you're like, yeah, they're not getting it. They're totally out. And then the people that look like they're in it, and then it's vice versa. The people who don't look like they're getting it are like soaking it in. But you just can't read what we think we see. We have to just like trust God and that He's going to do His part. So thank you for sharing that story. And God, thank you guys so much for tuning into this, just on how to learn and just how to, I guess, see the positive perspective of going through trials and adversity, different things like that. And knowing that we're all still growing, we're all still trying to be more like Christ, and just learning to have more patience with ourselves, but also patience with others as well. So thank you so much for coming on with me. I really had a blast. And please share this with someone else. I think this will be a huge profitable not only to you, but also to others as well. So please share this, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you for watching.